So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining this evening. It's great to have people from all around the United States joining us. And I know on occasion we get folks in from around the world too. So maybe we'll have
Wow.
a couple of folks from parts unknown. Thank you and welcome. So next slide, please. This, of course, is our business meeting and for the ENRE discipline, or excuse me, division and of APA. And this slide shows our executive committee. We've done some introductions around the table, but I'll just go through the list very quickly here. Myself as chair, Jessica Conquest as the chair-elect, Unai Miguel Andes, the secretary treasurer, who is being our MC for the evening. Although Travell, who is our professional development director, and Betty Avila, who helps us with communications. Next slide. So at this point, I'll pass it over to Jessica Conquest to take us through the rest of the presentation. Jessica.
So hello everyone, and thank you so much for taking the time to attend ENRE's annual business meeting for 2021. During this presentation, we're going to give a quick overview of what ENRE's been up to since we last met. Then we're going to look ahead to the next year and what we want to achieve in the months to come. During that time, we'll open it up for discussion, so please be ready to provide feedback and suggestions that you might have. Next slide. To kick off our discussion of last year, our fellowship winner from 2019-2020, Priya, will be giving a presentation of the work she did entitled Climate Blind Planning and the Rezoning of Downtown Far Rockaway. Priya?
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Priya Mulgaonkar. I use she, her pronouns, and I work as a project manager at Hester Street in New York City. I'm also about to graduate this week from Hunter College's Master of Urban Planning program. I actually have to run right after I present at my studio, so that's my last, like literally tonight I'm graduating. But I really appreciate the opportunity to present my research project and just really appreciate the support from the ENRE division for this project. So we can go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to try to keep it to 10 minutes. I'm going to just review kind of the sections of my paper, or some of the introduction and context, my methods, some key findings, and the implication and conclusion. Next slide, and you can actually go one more after that, please. Great. So a little bit of background. So my interest in this project really began in 2019. I was at the time working as the resiliency planner for the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, advocating for equitable climate change adaptation and mitigation policies for low-income communities of color, many of whom were hit hardest by Superstorm Sandy in 2012. And so I was really interested in my graduate work to explore kind of the discourse around resilience in planning and how it shifted after Sandy, particularly in New York City. And so resilience is often, oh, you can go, I'm just going to stay on that last slide. Thank you. Resilience is often described as the ability to recover from shock and disaster. It's increasingly used to describe kind of like structural adaptation to climate change risks through zoning, building code changes, physical barriers such as seawalls, increasingly social infrastructure such as community preparedness plans. And in the wake of Sandy, we've seen like a whole host of resilience plans and projects come out. You can see just a selection here from the New York City Office of Resiliency. And so I was really curious how these plans have been, like whether they've been effective in practice, basically. Next slide. So I started by looking into neighborhoods that were hit hardest by Superstorm Sandy. And the first one that really came to mind was the Rockaways, which is a peninsula in southeastern Queens. You can see in this map around in orange. It's a really economically diverse, but racially segregated community that has dealt with kind of really 40 years of municipal disinvestment, neglect. It's a host to several public housing developments, and Sandy really dealt a major blow to the peninsula. Residents experienced 5 to 6 feet of storm surge, fires, widespread power outages. Many, and particularly public housing residents, were left without heat, hot water, electricity, or cell phone service for weeks, even months, and suffered a really lingering aftermath of the storm. Damaged boilers, hot water issues, persistent mold and mildew for several months, and in some cases years after the storm. And so Sandy was sort of seen as this, like, harbinger of future risk to the Rockaways. And by the end of the century, sea level rise could actually raise just the daily tidal flooding on the majority of the peninsula to those even higher than Superstorm Sandy. So just daily, they would experience the same level of flooding that happened during the storm. Next slide, please. So I began kind of looking into resiliency efforts on the peninsula and started to come across a lot of articles that were actually about this real estate renaissance happening on the peninsula and a construction boom in communities actually hit hardest by Sandy. In the Rockaways, it seems like Sandy actually acted as a catalyst for new development, kind of shining a light on this kind of neglected, forgotten, supposedly community. There were 87 new residential developments constructed in 5 years after Sandy, which was actually kind of outpacing the recovery and kind of resilience efforts on the peninsula. In 2016, a working group convened to plan the revitalization of downtown Far Rockaway in particular, which was once this like vibrant economic hub for the peninsula and has seen decline over the last 40 years. And a 5-point plan was developed by members of a working group convened by the New York City Economic Development Corporation. But surprisingly, this roadmap for action that they produced actually had no mention of Sandy and no mention of climate change, which was sort of where I became really interested in this project. This roadmap was really used to kind of for the rezoning of downtown Far Rockaway, a process that happened over the course of 2017, and went through with a unanimous vote from the council. Was one of the least controversial rezonings in New York City. And if you know New York City, rezonings are always controversial. And this project is expected to, increase density in the downtown and yield over 3,000 new apartments, almost 164,000 gross square feet of retail space, and almost 90,000 gross square feet of community facility space. So quite a lot of added density. Next slide, please. So the kind of absence of climate resilience and references to Sandy in this roadmap really prompted my deeper research into this project and kind of raised this question of how this revitalization effort was justified by decision makers. How did climate change enter the conversation? How did resiliency enter the conversation? Next slide. So I'm just going to quickly touch on my methods on the next slide. So I did a content analysis over the course of the last kind of year and a half, a little bit stalled because of the pandemic. Understandably, it was really hard actually to access a lot of these documents during the pandemic, but finally got a hold of them last fall. I really wanted to focus on the key decision makers in the project, in the rezoning project, and review dozens of materials where you could really get a sense of how they were talking about this rezoning and how they were justifying it. As well as some technical documents such as the environmental review. And you can go to the next slide and actually one after. So I'll just go ahead and dive into my key findings. So the discourse surrounding the redevelopment of downtown Far Rockaway, all those documents that I reviewed, contained very few references to Sandy, to climate risk, and to flooding. When Sandy was referenced, it was mainly used as a justification for the need for this rezoning, for the need for this economic development, but not the need for more resilience investments in downtown. It was sort of not making, the connections were not being made to climate risk. Next slide. The second finding is that the environmental review did refer to the fact that the project itself is outside of the flood zone, which I'll show on a map a little bit later, but it included very little discussion of kind of the peninsula-wide risks to key infrastructure, to community preparedness. So for example, the kind of discussions around sewer and water infrastructure improvements, there was no clarity on whether the improvements were designed for just meeting the density increase associated with the rezoning, or is it going to actually have benefits in terms of sea level rise and the kind of long-term climate impacts? So it's really unclear if this project will actually be resilient to climate impacts in the long term. Next slide. So these were, because climate change was not part of kind of the dominant themes, I did want to highlight just the three that kept coming up across all of the sources. The first is that the rezoning is described as this long overdue intervention that is really key to revitalizing what is a long neglected community. The second is that the kind of lack of growth on the peninsula for the last 40 years is like the root of the problem. Is really pathologized, and that the solution is to spur more development. And third is that the rezoning itself was kind of heralded again as this like full consensus from community, really uncontentious, kind of full buy-in from stakeholders. And I'll go into some of the kind of implications in my analysis, but each of these three threads prevalent throughout the rezoning just really show a kind of lack of deep consideration of future and climate risk, which was very surprising given how much attention was paid to the Rockaways after Sandy, and really shows that the drivers behind the redevelopment are not sufficient to meet the reality of a climate changed New York. So my two kind of analytical points of the paper are that, even with the increased attention to climate change and the integration of resilience into top municipal priorities in New York, planners and municipal governments are still controlled by what Harvey and Mullich called the growth machine, that, municipal leaders are really bound to create plans and policies that center economic growth and are responsive to business, real estate, and financial interests, sometimes at the expense of the environment. And the solution that the municipal leaders in the Rockaways offered for the kind of post-Sandy recovery was to incentivize private investment to increase density in an area that is very vulnerable without any discourse about the potential risk. They kind of leveraged Sandy's impacts and an understandable kind of decades-long real desperation from community residents for investment. There's been a long-standing call for investment in this neighborhood to kind of justify this rezoning and kind of letting resilience fall by the wayside of the conversation. And the kind of second big theme I explore is that the rezoning was really justified because its boundaries just fall outside of the floodplain. But as I discuss more in my paper, floodplain maps are really an imperfect tool when planning on a fine scale. And as I show on the next slide, so you can see in the map on the left, this is kind of the current storm surge risks for the area, and then the rezoning boundary you can see zoomed in on the right. So it's clear to me as someone who was doing resilience planning for environmental justice, an organization for 5 years. I mean, I think it doesn't take that much to just see that this entire region is really at risk. And this map is actually a little misleading because it's bound within New York City municipal boundaries, and to the right is actually Long Island, but that whole area is also at severe risk. So it seems like the project that is bound by this, even if when they're using the flood projections to justify that the project is resilient, it just seems to neglect that the entire rest of the peninsula, surrounding stakeholder communities for whom this rezoning is supposed to benefit, are at kind of a long-term risk, as well as kind of the long-term risk to critical infrastructure like water, stormwater systems, wastewater treatment, transit, et cetera, was really absent from the analysis. Next slide, please. And so just kind of concluding here, my primary conclusion is that despite increased attention to resilience and climate change in municipal governments, climate justice is still not a central feature of the planning process. And climate risks really just join a long line of considerations when planning a project and kind of fall lower on the list of priorities than economic development. And the growth machine's influence on definitions of resilience has yielded a kind of climate blind approach to planning in which the true risks of climate change are really understated and absent from the discourse to accommodate continued economic growth and real estate speculation. So this case in the Rockaways also illustrates a real mismatch of timescales of climate risk and adaptation and kind of economic development and coastal development. You know, it took 40 years for downtown Far Rockaway to really advocate for this investment in the downtown, but the kind of consequences of neglecting a comprehensive and equitable approach to resilience in that rezoning may not actually be felt for another 40 years. And so, you know, my biggest conclusion really is that I think planners need to be mindful of the kind of shortcomings and limitations of the tools we use for recovery and economic development, and think about climate change planning more comprehensively so that resilience is really a central component as opposed to sort of a piecemeal effort. So that is it. I have one more slide just to say thank you so much to ENRE, and I wanted to also give a thanks to my advisor, Professor Lily Pollins at Hunter, who was really instrumental in making this project happen. Really appreciate the opportunity. And I can stick around for maybe one, if there's a question, I can stick around, but I do have to jump and present for my studio in a sec, but I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks, Priya. We really appreciate you sharing your findings with us today. Does anyone have one burning question that they wanted to ask her before she hops off? Or
I have one really quick question.
Okay.
Were future scenarios looked at for climate, for sea level rise?
Yes, so the environmental review didn't look at future scenarios because the boundaries of the zoning were not in the, so I'll take a step back. Yes, they looked at the future projections in terms of sea level rise and storm surge risk, but it was sort of concluded that because the boundaries of the rezoning area do not fall within the projections, that it was not needed to have further resilience investment or consideration. So I think what concerns me is that there was kind of subsequently no consideration when it came to the analysis around sewer, stormwater, transit infrastructure. So it's sort of a cascading effect where because the boundaries of the rezoning were not quite within the floodplain, even though the entirety of the peninsula and surrounding communities are, it was sort of absent throughout the rest of the environmental review.
Okay, thank you.
I can also share my email in the chat if anyone has feedback as well is welcome. And thank you so much. I'm sorry I have to jump off.
Happy graduation.
Thank you so much.
Great job.
Have a good rest of your evening. Thank you.
So some of the other happenings that have happened within ENRE over the past year are that we had some virtual happy hours with the Sustainable Communities Division, as well as the Transportation Division. We also had a student spotlight happy hour last fall, which was used to showcase some of the work being done by our student members. We've onboarded some new volunteers and are looking forward to working with them more in the upcoming year. And we also transitioned to the new APA website platform. We also wanted to take this opportunity to highlight our fellowship winner for 2020-2021, which is Angela. She's currently working on examining corporate social responsibility and sustainable development within the Philippines. So last year, our total membership dropped by about 29%. Our drop in membership was mostly from student members, with our drop in non-student members at only about 2%, which is pretty good considering the pandemic. And given that our budget has not been severely impacted by the pandemic so far, we plan on using the remaining budget for the year to develop webinars and provide additional web networking and social opportunities. So what's next? Well, in June, we'll be having a webinar entitled, "What's All of This I Hear About Climate Change?" And then later in the summer and into the fall, we plan to have happy hours with more of APA's divisions. And we'll soon start planning for our upcoming 2021-2022 fellowship. Which brings us to our next topic, which is the 2022 work plan. For our work plan, we have two primary areas of focus that we're going to be looking at: professional development and communications. For professional development, some of the questions that we have for you are: what would make a really engaging webinar? What are some of the focus areas that you'd like to learn more about that relate to environmental planning? And where do you see the practice of environmental planning growing as we go into the future? And then for communications, some of the questions that we have for you are just kind of the general: what's working, what's not working. We currently use email, Facebook, and LinkedIn to reach members. Do some of these work better than others? Are there some new platforms out there that we should be considering? And then another question that we wanted to pose is whether there'd be any interest in moving away from our newsletters that we send out to having more e-blasts, like more substantial, heartier, detailed e-blasts. This is something that we've noticed other divisions are doing, and so we wanted to kind of gauge membership interest in whether or not that was a direction that ENRE would like to go towards. So now we want to open it up to discussion.